We want to understand why monopoly power is harmful. To get at that idea, we need to start with what happens in a competitive situation and then compare the results under competition with the result that we see under monopoly. The starting point for that discussion is this idea of a demand curve that we see in the first slide. The demand curve captures a very simple idea that consumers who face prices will buy more when the price is lower, and that's our everyday experience. The demand curve also is a way of capturing the value that a customer has for the product in question. Customers who value it more, in some sense, are at the top part of the demand curve. Customers who value it less at the lower part. In this particular situation, we've attached a simple equation to the demand curve, which will be useful for the rest of the calculations. Where do we go from there? That's where we turn to the next slide. On the next slide, we want to incorporate not merely the consumer side, but also the supplier side. And here, the way we think of what suppliers are willing to create, to build the product, is based upon the cost of doing so. Where here we focus on the marginal cost, the cost of creating the next unit, and that's assumed to be flat and constant. The other assumption here is, and under competition, is that we have many producers capable of using this technology to make the product. Okay, so technology is in some sense readily accessible and the product's buildable by many firms. The question is, in the face of that, how should we think about what happens? And the answer to that is, in a competitive economy, the definition in some sense of a competitive sector of that economy is that we think price will move towards marginal cost. Let's talk about that idea for just a second. The producers in this situation are price takers. They don't think that they can set the market price. They simply see the price in the market and respond to it. What they focus on is the relationship between the price that they can sell the next unit at and the cost of making the next unit. That's the marginal cost. If the price is above marginal cost, then that's a signal from the market that they should produce more. If price is below marginal cost, a signal that they should produce less. That's what they do. Now, even though individually they can't, as it were, set price, in the aggregate, of course, as more is produced or as less is produced, we have to sort of move up and down the demand curve. We can't sell more of the product at the same price. That's inconsistent with the idea of a demand curve slope down. So that natural process of producers producing more or less, depending upon the relationship between price and marginal cost, then tells us how we can figure out what will be produced in a competitive economy. And the answer to that is it's exactly at the point where the demand curve intersects marginal cost, or in the picture, at the point QC. That's the point of intersection, and that's given by where the red box is in the picture. There's one other idea that we need to have in mind, and that's the idea of consumer surplus. To what extent are consumers doing better than just what than the amount they paid for the product? There are some customers who value the product for substantially more than they paid for it. We want to capture that idea and a notion. That's an important value, and that's captured by this notion of consumer surplus. And consumer surplus, as you can see, when the arrow is given by this pretty large red triangle that's defined by the area between the marginal cost curve and the demand curve. And if you are remember 8th grade geometry, you can calculate the value of that area as 1/2 the base times the height. But we didn't do that yesterday in class. Okay, that's what happens in a competitive situation. Price equals marginal cost. We produce just to the point that it's socially efficient to do so. If we made more, we'd be producing goods at a point where the cost of them was more than someone would value them. If we were producing less, we wouldn't be fully exploiting the benefits of the demand curve. Now the question is what happens. Also we should focus on what happens to producers in this situation. And in this particular version, total revenues are given by price times quantity, and that's just equal to total cost. And indeed, that's one way of talking about what it means to have a competitive economy, is the idea of zero economic profits. What happens in a monopoly situation? To know the answer to that, we need to introduce one more construct to our analysis, because for the monopolist, the analysis is a little different. The monopolist recognizes that he or she is a price setter, that the decisions that the monopolist makes regarding production have consequences for price, and the monopolist critically recognizes that to sell another unit, price is going to have to go down. And that's going to have consequences for the revenues they would have made on the quantity they would have sold at the old price. Put differently, as I put it in class yesterday, the monopolist internalizes the consequences of production decisions for market price in a way that competitors do not. That idea is captured in marginal revenue, and that's simply the notion that if I sell another unit of the good in question, I have to reduce price. I will get extra revenue because I will sell another unit, but I have to reduce that by the revenue I will lose on the units I would have sold at the old price. And I showed you an example of how to calculate that in class yesterday using the forbidden calculus. Okay, but that here is simply represented by the magenta line, and then we can do our work. For the monopolist sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. That's the point at which the monopolist maximizes profits. And that's because what the monopolist is looking at is the idea that can I make more off the next unit than it costs me to make it? Well, the cost is still the same, it's the marginal cost, but the more that I will make over the next unit is simply given by marginal revenue. So it's this point of intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost that determines where the monopolist will produce. And once we have that point, then we can do just a little bit more work. From there, we can read off the quantity produced by the monopolist and the price produced by selling at that level. Focus on what happens now to our formerly large red triangle. Before we had a red triangle which took up these three spaces, the two different triangles and then the rectangle. Now, as you can see following the green arrow, it's simply the smaller consumer surplus triangle. There are still some consumers who value the good for more than it costs to make it, who value the good for more than the price, and they're getting consumer surplus. But that has really been drastically reduced from before, where consumer surplus was given really by these three areas. Now we're down to one. Okay, that's an important idea. What's happened to what's happened to that area, that big red triangle? Well, part of that now becomes actual profits for the monopolist. Profits meaning that the price at which the monopolist is selling, given by PM here, is above the cost that it's costing to produce at the marginal cost. And so the difference between PM and a marginal cost, that is a per unit sold profit. And that's what the purple or magenta rectangle there represents, is the actual profits in an economic sense of the monopolist. Our monopolist actually has costs as well, and those are the break-even. Those are the costs represented by total cost, the cost of quantity times marginal cost. But the point of real interest for us is what we call the deadweight loss triangle. And the deadweight loss triangle here is the green triangle that I'm currently pointing to. And these are sales that are not made. The monopolist has taken the quantity that would have been sold in a competitive framework from QC, reduced that down to QM, and that lost sales gives rise to this deadweight loss triangle. Those represent situations where consumers value those units for more than it costs to produce them, and the monopolist simply won't produce them because it's not in its private interest to do so. That's the central harm of monopoly. Reduced output leading to deadweight loss triangles.